here's what I want to do now. We're trying to get our hands on what we mean by the concept of democracy. If you're reading in the Dahl book, you're following along with his attempt to, in a very systematic way, say, okay, what is democracy? What are the conditions required to establish democracy? What are the impediments to democracy? What have we accomplished? What's left to accomplish? The Dahl book, I'm not going to talk a lot about the Dahl book in class because I think it's very straightforward. I like the book. It sometimes might seem almost a little too simple, but I think it's helpful to organize our thinking. So what we're doing in this class, in the lectures, is using the Dahl book as a sort of base. I'm not going to tell you what was in the Dahl book. You can read and understand that yourself. We're going to go on and try and deepen what I think are our understanding about some key points. What I want to do today is talk about, as I said, some of the things that I would call impediments to healthy democratic conversation. Things that get in the way of us trying to really deal with public discussions of politics, of power. Okay? I'm going to give you 3 of these. Hold on. Yep. I'm going to give you 3 of these. These are the 3 things. If we have time, I'll try to talk about all of them. The first is a statement that you will often hear. The greatest nation on earth. You'll hear the United States described as the greatest nation on earth. Okay? We're going to talk a bit about what that might mean. Next, I want to talk about a concept that you often hear invoked by politicians across the board, the national interest, the idea of working in the national interest. And then if we have time, I want to talk a bit about the idea of being anti-American. Okay? So that's our charge for today. I'd like to talk a little bit about important advances in mortgage rates. Now, I don't want to talk about that. Let me see. Help me out here. Oh, yeah. Did I get it right? I shouldn't. All right, let's get that. It's out of control here, folks. All right. The first one, the greatest nation on earth. All right. The statement, the greatest nation on earth. Actually, too many buttons to push. Let's step back for a second. All right. I'm talking about, remember I said I want to talk about lazy rhetorical constructions. Things people say that I'm going to argue are lazy. Lazy meaning they reflect a lazy thinking and therefore don't advance our understanding of the world too much. The first one we're going to talk about is this notion of the United States being the greatest nation on earth. But let's step back first. Let me give you an example from another realm. Imagine that you had, most of you don't have children of your own. My advice is keep it that way. But that's another story. Imagine you have a niece or a nephew. Okay? You're back among your family and you have a niece or a nephew, one of your favorite nieces or nephews. And this young person comes up to you, and let's say they're 9 years old. And your niece says to you, you know, uncle or aunt, I've decided that, I'm the greatest 9-year-old in the world. I am the greatest 9-year-old on the planet today. What would you say if you cared about this child? Would you say, yes, indeed, Sally or Johnny or Jorge or whatever, yes, indeed, you are the greatest 9-year-old I've ever seen. Go out there and be great because you are. No, you wouldn't say that, would you? No, you wouldn't want to indulge that kind of delusional thinking in a 9-year-old. Here's what I would say. I would say, listen, kid, here's the way the world is. Number one, it's kind of an odd statement. If you think of all the millions of 9-year-olds on the planet today, to assert that one particular 9-year-old is the greatest, it assumes that you can take all of the complexity on which we might evaluate a person and come to some conclusion that one of those people rates the highest. Doesn't make any sense. Right? If I were to say I'm the greatest professor at UT, you would say, well, on what criteria do you imagine you can make an evaluation and come to the conclusion? The claim itself doesn't make any sense. And then you'd probably say to the niece or nephew, and by the way, so far based on your performance, you don't seem to be the greatest. a little healthy humility is always good for kids. Okay, so if in our lives we would never make the claim that we are the greatest, and if somebody else made the claim, we'd probably laugh at them for the delusional level of thinking. Right? Might the same thing apply at the level of the nation state? Well, apparently it doesn't. So let me give you an example. This is a recent column from the National Review online. The National Review, as many of you may know, is probably one of the 2 or 3 leading conservative magazines in the United States. It's been around for a long time. It's one of those places where folks go to see what are conservative political folks in the United States thinking these days. Rich Lowry, I think, is the editor of the National Review. So in a column at the end of last year, sort of looking back at the year, he says, yes, the greatest country ever. And he makes the argument that the United States is the greatest nation on earth, okay? He says, I don't know if you can read this, our greatness is simply a fact. Simply a fact. Might you contest it? Well, if you do, only the churlish or malevolent can deny that. So if you don't agree with Rich Lowry that the United States is the greatest nation ever, you're either churlish, just kind of grumpy, or you're malevolent. You have evil intent. Figure out which one you are. All right? All right. So, the greatest nation on earth, even though we might recognize that in any other context, any other person or institution making the claim to be the greatest, it would be silly. It would be a ridiculous claim. Yet it's commonly made. All right, that's from the political right. Let's take a look at the common way in which this is expressed by others. This is a clip from the State of the Union, which just happened the other evening.
We may have differences in policy, but we all believe in the rights enshrined in our Constitution. We may have different opinions, but we believe in the same promise that says, this is a place where you can make it if you try. We may have different backgrounds, but we believe in the same dream that says, this is a country where anything is possible, no matter who you are, no matter where you come from. That dream is why I can stand here before you tonight. That dream is why a working class kid from Scranton can sit behind me. That dream is why someone who began by sweeping the floors of his father's Cincinnati bar can preside as Speaker of the House in the greatest nation on earth.
Greatest nation on earth. Wild applause in Congress. So here we have it. We have Rich Lowry, a representative of very conservative politics in the United States, probably somebody who doesn't like Barack Obama very much. You hear Rich Lowry talking about the Obama administration, you get the impression he doesn't much like it. Okay? Rich Lowry asserts the greatest nation on earth. And the politician he is always chewing on the leg of, Barack Obama, stands up in front of the whole country. Greatest nation on earth. Wild applause. Right? Greatest nation on earth. The claim that we would not accept from our 9-year-old niece or nephew, we wildly applaud at the level of the nation state. Does that help us understand the world in which we live, the nature of the systems in which we live, and how we might want to change those systems? Does rhetoric like the greatest nation on earth help us? That's the question. Right. Now you might be saying, I'm trying to anticipate comments, you might be saying, well, okay, maybe the greatest nation on earth is a bit hyperbolic. Maybe it's not appropriate to say any one person, any one nation, any one thing is the greatest. But let's face it, the United States does pretty well. And maybe we are the greatest nation on earth in some ways. So let's expose that to a little bit of empirical inquiry. Let's ask. Right? Where are they? Where do we fit in the world? Well, let's look at some statistics. This is the Human Development Index. The Human Development Index is a statistical measure developed by international organizations to try and chart the quality of life in any country. Now, that's a tough thing to do. How do you create a statistical picture of the quality of life and then rank nations? Well, it's difficult, but statisticians are always working hard for us. And they have developed what is widely understood to be one of the most reliable measures of that, the Human Development Index. Now, if we were the greatest nation on Earth, where would we fall in the ranking on the Human Development Index, do you think? One. Of course, greatest nation. Who would be on top of the pile? The United States, yes? And we would be chanting what? We're number one. Okay. Well, you find that we're up high, but we come in at number 4. So I'm just going to suggest that instead of chanting we're number 1, we have to modify. We're number 4. We're number 4. Okay, well, 4 is not bad. 4 is not bad in the world. Any Norwegians in the room at the moment? Any citizens, residents, or people who claim primary affiliation to Norway? Well, in Norway they get to chant, we're number 1, except Norwegians are very calm and unemotional people, so they wouldn't be chanting. That's not the way they do things in Norway. All right. Now, the good news is we're up. We were number 13 last year, so we're up to number 4. All right. So we're high in the level, high on the list in terms of Human Development Index. Let's look at some other measures. World Health Organization statistics, quality of health care. We're number 37. We're number 37. And you might say, well, okay, but let's remember, we're making the claim to be the greatest nation on Earth. Let's remember one other fact. The United States is, without doubt, the richest nation in the history of the world. Size of the economy, the amount of wealth. The United States is the most affluent country in the history of the world. That's true. In terms of wealth, the United States is, in fact, number 1. But on the level of quality of health care, we're number 37. Now, there are a few things in which we rank high. Worldwide military expenditures, we are number 1 in that. We spend a whole lot of money on our military. And in fact, with the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the United States continued to spend. Other nations started to drop. Sometimes that changes. China is increasing its own military expenditures. But depending on how you look at the numbers, and there's always different ways to add all of this stuff, the United States is getting to the point where we spend almost as much money on the military in the United States as the rest of the world combined. All right? Here's another one. Arms sales. The United States ranks number 1 unchallenged in arms sales. In other words, we not only spend a tremendous amount of money on our own military, we also sell a tremendous amount of military hardware to the world, outstripping any other nation. Here's one other place where we rank very high. Incarceration rates. In terms of developed countries, the OECD, which is a grouping of the most developed, the industrial countries, we far and away rate number 1 on the percentage of our population we keep in prison. If you expand beyond just the developed countries, you find that we rank very high. We're one of the top 10 countries in terms of incarceration more generally. So we incarcerate a higher percentage of our population than Russia. All right, so none of this is meant to say, and don't get me wrong, that there's nothing good going on in the United States. None of this is meant to say that the United States is the worst country in the world. This is just meant to say that if we're going to engage in democratic dialogue, if we're going to start having a conversation that helps us expand and deepen democracy, if we're going to deal with the problems that in fact we have, just like any other nation, it may be to our advantage to let go of some of this, what I'm calling lazy rhetoric, such as the greatest nation on earth. Because if we assert that we are the greatest nation on earth, then that assertion, which is enforced across the mainstream political spectrum, from the hard right to the kind of centrist liberal edge, if everybody in the mainstream political arena, the people you see on TV, the people who get elected to Congress, the people who write for important magazines, if they all agree that America is the greatest nation on earth, then the ability to step back and say, in what ways might the system in which we live have produced conditions in which we cannot make that claim, becomes more difficult. The kind of deep critique, the systematic critique that might be necessary, becomes very difficult. Because the price of admission to mainstream politics is to agree that we're the greatest nation on earth. Right? That's what you have to say to get in the room. And once you've said that, then it becomes very hard to do that kind of systematic critique. So, the greatest nation on earth, I'm sure you've heard politicians say it. I once collected a list of all the political figures in a particular time period, and it does run the gamut from the right to the center left. Okay? It's very common. Does it help us understand the world we live in? I'm going to argue it doesn't. Okay? I want to move on, and then we'll leave some time for discussion at the end, but I want to move on to that second item on the list, the national interest. Okay? You hear that a lot as well. We should be working in the national interest. Agreed? That we need to come together and unify to work for the national interest, right? You're all good Americans. Some of you may not be permanent residents or citizens of the United States, but for purposes of this discussion, we're all Americans here. We're part of the J310 family, right, with those high SAT scores. We are all trying to advance the national interest, correct? Right? We're all going to dig in and try to serve the national interest, correct? I mean, that's what we're all here for, correct? Well, let's think about that term for a minute, the national interest. How many people live in the United States today, roughly? 300 million. A lot of people. 300 million people. They live in all sorts of different places. They have access to all different sorts of level of status, wealth, and power. They come from a variety of racial and ethnic groups. There are men, there are women, there's a lot of diversity in this country, yes? And not just diversity around the markers we typically talk about, like race. Diversity of all sorts. Yeah? Different levels of education. Right? That's a lot of diversity. Now, the national interest. Think about all those different kinds of people. Right? And you say you want to work in the national interest. What does that mean for that wide range of people? Okay? In other words, what I'm asking is a very simple question. What is actually in the national interest? What is actually in the interest of every single one of those 300 million people? Well, that gets complicated. Okay, you could say, well, at the very least, survival, yes? It's in our national interest to continue living till tomorrow. Yeah, that's true, but that's not really what we mean when we talk about the national interest. Right? I mean, all human beings have a survival interest, but that's not really relevant to this discussion of the national interest. The question I want to ask is, what policy might embody a true national interest? Well, you might say, all right, at the very least, we all want to be secure in our country from foreign invasion, correct? Everybody wants that. Right? Everybody wants to be secure knowing that the national boundaries of the United States are intact and we are safe and secure in those boundaries, right? That's a national interest. Okay? Or is it? Might there be people who actually would invite foreign invasion? Right? Might there be people in the United States who say, well, you know, my lot in life is pretty crappy, and I might do better. I'm from North Dakota. I can imagine groups of people, up around where I was born, very close to the Canadian border. You know, a couple of miles either way, I'd be a Canadian. Right? And what if there were a group of people up around the Canadian border in North Dakota who said, you know, Canada's got national health insurance. They do, you know. If you're, we just had Canadians visiting, and they were gloating about their national health insurance, their system where nobody's uninsured. Everybody has access to reasonably good health care. So let's say you're living up on the Canadian border in North Dakota, and you don't have health insurance, and you're thinking to yourself, damn, I wish I were a Canadian. You might invite foreign invasion, yes? You might say to the Canadians, come on down, take out a swatch of North Dakota. I want to be a Canadian. Maybe, in fact, not all citizens actually want. Now, that's a silly example, but you can imagine, especially times in U.S. history in the past, where that would have been a serious consideration. Imagine you're a person of African descent enslaved in the American South. Is it, in fact, in your national interest to want to remain in that condition, or might foreign invasion sound pretty good? Imagine you are living on the Mexican border, especially at periods of time in which Mexican Americans were the subject of incredibly harsh racist discrimination. In fact, you might welcome a Mexican invasion of the southern United States to retake that land and become part of Mexico again. Okay, so even the simple claim that it's in the national interest to be safe from foreign invasion actually is not so simple. There might be all sorts of times and places where people would come to the conclusion that the nation state in which they live, whether it's the United States or anywhere else, no longer was capable of serving their needs, and that, in fact, foreign invasion would be welcome to join another state, another country. All right. The point I'm making is pretty clear. If you go down the line, is there any policy that you can really say is in the national interest, in the interest of all people? Or is, in fact, politics the struggle between special interests? Okay. Special interests. Now, this is a term you hear all the time, and usually in a negative sense. Well, we don't want to cave into the special interests, right? The special interests, it is asserted, deform politics. The way it's usually articulated is we want to all serve the national interest, and it's the special interests that undermine that unity of purpose, correct? And so the special interests are bad. That's a rhetorical construction. It's one of these constructions I want to argue is very lazy. You know why? Because there is no national interest. There is no single unified national interest. In a world with this much complexity, it is impossible to articulate something that is in the national interest beyond mere survival, and even that gets tricky. That you're always talking about conflict between special interests. People who come from different places, have different status in society, and have different goals, and they're struggling. Right? And that politics is not deformed by special interests. Politics in a complex society is defined by the struggle of special interests. There's nothing wrong with it. That's what politics is. It's special interest battling. Take an obvious example, tax policy. Right? A nation state has to raise revenue. Those revenues come from taxes. There's got to be some way in which those taxes are assessed. Right? Any way that you decide to assess taxes is going to be in the interests of some, not the interests of others. If you have 100% tax on every income above $100,000, if you make more than $100,000, 100% of that money is confiscated by the government for taxes. That's a tax scheme. That might be in the interests of poor people. Right? It's definitely not, at least in the material short-term sense, not in the interests of people who make over $100,000. Which is the appropriate tax policy? One that levies 100% tax on incomes over $100,000? Or some other scheme? Well, there's no way you can make a claim that one of those is in the national interest and another just is in the special interest. There are always special interests conflicting. And instead of pretending there's a national interest, what I'm arguing is we should recognize that it's always about special interests in conflict. Why? Because you do hear this national interest. invoked all the time. And when you hear it invoked, know that somebody's trying to con you. If somebody says to you, this is in the national interest, it's one of those times, again, where they're saying to you, I don't think you're smart enough to see what's really going on. Because if there is nothing but a contest between special interests, when somebody claims the national interest, they're claiming that their special interest should be primary. And they're doing it not by making a compelling argument for it, they're doing it by a lazy rhetorical trick of trying to identify their special interest as the national interest. Now, by saying that, I don't want to mean that I don't want to suggest that all special interests are somehow equal and it's just about the struggle. Right? It's just about who ends up being more powerful. You can make an argument that the assertion of some special interest is a superior policy to the assertion of another special interest, either on empirical grounds or moral grounds, all sorts of ways you can argue for policies. I'm not saying that politics is nothing but throwing your elbows around trying to win your position. There are arguments to be made for and against policies, and from my point of view, some are often better than others. But none of them win simply by asserting that they are the national interest. When somebody tells you that their approach to governance is in the national interest, it probably means that they're in a position of some authority, some power, some wealth that allows them to make that claim. And it allows them to label the claims that others make as special interests. You see this most in the last 2 or 3 decades, in which a lot of the groups that challenge the authority of the elite, we've talked about it before, the social movements that come out of the 1960s and 70s, the civil rights movement and other forms of nationalism based around race, the women's movement, the student movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, all of those are often talked about in mainstream political discourse as if they are special interests. Right? By claiming that they are special interests, the people making that claim are trying to suggest that their position is the national interest and they're defending the national interest from these special interests. One way to see that is that, in fact, what you're seeing is those people with power status who have been on top are trying to argue that challenges from below must be rebuffed in the service of this concept of the national interest. But if the concept of the national interest is in fact a fiction, then it's not a strong argument. So I want you to think about that the next time you hear somebody saying, we must work in the national interest. Ask yourself, in the interest of which part of the nation are you speaking? And if you're making a claim that it's in everyone's interest, you've got a really difficult challenge to claim that this is in fact in the interest of every single person in the United States. All right.